Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead. And welcome to episode 8 of our limited series, Real Life Sabbatical. Episode 8 is focusing on my writebacks and note-taking. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I am doing with all of the research and how I'm eventually taking what I'm reading, what I'm taking notes on, and how I'm actually turning it into something. This is another spot that I feel is very absent from our discussions of the scholarly writing process. So we know that our colleagues are reading materials, and we know that quotes from some of those materials or paraphrases or, ideas or structures or whatever get into a produced book chapter, a monograph, a lab report, an article. We know that that happens, but it's very difficult to see how somebody goes from reading and researching to producing some writing. And so what I want to talk about today, I'll explore it in one of our other podcast episodes too, because not everybody's listening to the Real Life Sabbatical series, probably because many people are not on sabbatical, so maybe it's not relevant at the moment. But I wanted to say something briefly about it here because this is happening now. So when we're talking about like a real life sabbatical, this is what I've been working on over the past couple of weeks. And so I mentioned that I'm a visiting scholar. I'm doing that at Ohio State. So I do kind of a longer commute once or twice a week to work on location. So when I'm there, one of the things that I knew and I've talked about this in other sabbatical episodes, but I know that I am not putting a big time clock on myself. I am bounded by time because a lot of times I'm there for kind of a long day, but then I have to come back. So I'm not bounded by time, but I am trying to make sure that when I'm there, time slows down a little bit. I can do some reading, I can do some note taking and all of that. And so for the first couple of weeks during the sabbatical, or at least like the first weeks when I was really on location. So let's say, mid to late January through maybe the beginning of March. So let's say it wasn't just a couple of weeks. Let's say it's like 6 weeks or something like that. What I did then is I honestly just looked for resources. I read some articles. I worked on some other writing I needed to do. What I'm actually doing on the sabbatical is I'm eventually going to produce an article that has interviews with faculty about their writing processes and specifically how they get from an idea to a publication. If you heard me talk about this project in one of the earlier sabbatical episodes, I might not have described it that way. It's because my thinking is now refined a little bit about how I want to do it. And I'm focusing on using a narrative methodology to capture those processes. So I want to listen to how faculty talk about how they go from an idea to a publication. So I'm totally interested in this because I always like to show with a lot of our work with Defend, Publish, and Lead, and also in the way that we teach it in our coaching. So this is a side note, but if anybody is on sabbatical, going on sabbatical, or just wants to do some summer writing with us where you kind of do this work, because we're writing teachers, this is the kind of stuff that we do. So, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on our website, Defend, Publish, and Lead. There's a button for contact me, or if you want to learn more, I'll also have contact information in the show notes, or you can just look us up, Defend, Publish, Lead, and find us. But this is something that I think a lot of faculty struggle with, and I do coach a lot of faculty at my own institution where, especially for newer writers, writing a dissertation or writing something like that is not totally the same thing as trying to produce a scholarly article that you have to do again and again, where you might have to do some research, you might have to read some things to develop a literature review, and then somehow all that stuff has to show up in a piece of writing. So here is how I have been doing it for a while. I mean, this has been kind of a refined process for me. It will probably come as no surprise to podcast listeners. I'm showing a Penzu note on screen because this is where I take my notes, but Google would be just fine. You might have this in Microsoft Word. You might have this, I'm also holding up now a yellow notepad. You might have a yellow notepad where you do it, or I'm also holding up a notebook. Like you might put any of these types of things in one spot that's not digital. I've mentioned all the time why I like Penzu, and it's mainly because I can have searchable notes and things like that. So that being said, here's some things that I have been doing. I was making individual notes about different concepts. I kind of started that way with Penzu, and I've refined my thinking a little bit in terms of how I want to take these notes, because now I'm almost using the note itself as a spot to draft out some things. So here's a couple. I'm going to talk about what's on screen. This episode too might be a good one to see on YouTube because you can actually see what I wrote in my notes. So if you're an audio only listener, it might be worth checking out YouTube for that one. But what's on screen is basically my notes. I had a date at the top for the 22nd of March. I've touched this note many times since then, so I really need to probably change the title in here. But what's in here is a couple of different things. One is some brainstorms about a title for this article, because for me, I do start thinking about titles earlier in the process. So I have two in there. One of them, I thought it was kind of fun. It was like how I made that CV line, colon, because of course there has to be a colon, writing process capture from idea to publication. That's one of the titles that I have right now going. And that may be the one that I end up using. But I'm also kind of looking at this idea of using threshold concepts, which is not a new idea in rhetoric and composition or writing studies. There's been a lot of work done on it. But why I want it is something that I discovered by taking notes. And so that's what I want to show you today. So one of the things I've done all along in my note taking, and this note is a very long one full of text on screen. So this is not something that people can read. I just wanted you to kind of see how long the note is and also what I'm doing with it. But what I tend to do is for an online article, I usually put the web link in there, and then I write a little note about where quotes came from and a little note about why I want this source. That's something that I've talked about in other sabbatical episodes. So what shows up in my note are some quotes that kind of capture faculty talking about their writing processes. So I was lucky enough the last time I was there to come across a really good article by two colleagues in my field, Derek and Hannah, that talk about threshold concepts in writing studies. I'll actually put a link to their article because it is for rhetoric and composition people, and I know we have some that listen to this podcast. This is a great article, and I like both of their work, so I was excited to discover it. But they basically talk about their own writing process in a narrative way that I might want the faculty I interview to do. So I kept that. But then here's where I'm starting to think about not just taking the note, like not just taking the quote and why I want it, but I do something called write backs. So I call them, they're just a WB. And it basically is me responding to whatever I captured out of that article. So I do a lot of like quote dumping in my note. I might have some paraphrases already. Usually I start with quotes and then paraphrase down as I move them into an article, and then cite them, of course. But for a write back, what I mean by that is I just put like a little WB and a colon, and then I write a little note after a quote, which is me talking to myself about why I want the material, and then how does it differ from what I want to do. So here was the note I wrote. I have two quotes from Derek and Hannah where they describe their own writing processes for creating the article that they were working on. And so what I wrote in my write back was, these were a lot of projects that are not, these were on the, different projects that they worked on, because I actually talked about several projects in there. It wasn't from just one idea to a published argument. And that's the thing I want to capture. I want to capture beginning to the end of a writing project. So once you have the idea, what does it take from that idea to get all the way out the door to a finished publication? And so I put a little note like, this is really helpful because it builds a conversation about the process by writing studies faculty, who are basically saying, what are the nuts and bolts of how I got from, ideas to publications? They're talking about it more in just general writing strategies they use to produce a lot of things, including the article they wrote together. I'm interested in a single item. But my write back clarifies that for me, because it says, here's what here's why you want this. Here's what you want to say. You can say, look, there's this discussion happening in the field. Here's some models of what this language looks like, but it's about multiple projects, not a singular project. So that's something that I wanted to make a note in here. And then, because I'm always thinking about the podcast, I have a little blue note in there that's because I changed the color of the font that says, hey, here's a potential podcast. You'll see that sometimes in my notes because, of course, as I'm writing, I think about new things to share. So that's in there. because I said, oh, I really should interview Derek and Hannah. So Derek and Hannah, if you're listening, I'm coming for you. I'm going to see if you want to, do a podcast, because they both have really cool ideas about writing strategies that I think would be fun to interview them. Okay. So then I have more like quotes from them. I have some more titles that I'm thinking about. I have more write backs that I do in here. So basically I'm pulling quotes from this particular article, and I have this like WB. And another write back or a WB note I put after some quotes from that article and some others is that the way that we talk about scholarly writing is that a lot of times we say, it's kind of linear. Like you do your research and then you write it up, or you have an idea, you make a draft, of course, do literature review, maybe you're doing some research, whatever. And then you work for a publication. Maybe somebody says no, you revise it, you submit it somewhere else, and keep going until someone says yes. Like it's still kind of a linear process. Now, we know through writing studies, for people that are writing study scholars, we know that it's not really like that. There can be lots of hopping back and forth from writing a little bit and then going back to whatever your initial idea was, and then maybe doing some brainstorming and coming back. Like we know that it can be more recursive than that. But what I know I want to capture in my particular project is these, they're not necessarily phases, but they're basically like times when like, have I settled on an idea or not for a publication? So just really cool stuff like that. I have little questions I wrote in my write backs, like how do ideas grow into publications? Do faculty do meta writing about the writing to figure that out? So that's something that I do here. So there's just some questions that I came up with in here to answer for myself. So I still need to do that. And then other notes, I did find some good models for methodology. Finally, that was something I talked about earlier in this Real Life Sabbatical podcast, because I have not yet seen the kind of narrative model that might be something that I could use for developing, say, interview questions. But I did come across one that gave me a better grip on how I might do that. So that's another thing in the note. And of course, I did some write backs about, hey, this model is kind of what I'm looking for, but here's what I'm going to do that's different and how I'm going to build on some of the theories and the models. So that's the kind of stuff that's showing up in here. And so how this stuff will eventually get into the article, so eventually become the bones of the article. So maybe that'll be my other podcast. It'll be something about like, ideas to bones or something. But one of the things that is really helpful for me then is when I'm building the article. Right now, this note is not in any kind of order at all. It's sort of whenever I found a source, I took some notes, I made some write backs. Anything in blue, because this is all in black font, but anything in blue is podcast ideas. I will probably start thinking about an outline for this article in a separate note once I have a much better grip on how I want to put it together. Right now, this super long note is just my pulling from sources, writing back to them, pulling from sources, writing back to them. So one of the things I think this is also really helpful for is that sometimes I'll look at a source, because we always talk about like deciding if you're going to use a source or not. Sometimes I'll look at a source and say, well, this seems like it just said something I wrote about when I was writing back to another source. So I'll know, I maybe don't need that. Other things that this can be really helpful for is sometimes I'll read it, but I don't know when I'm trying to like write back why I want the source or what it's going to do for me. Sometimes I'll realize right away, like this article isn't really going to do anything for this particular topic. It might be a really cool source. And so sometimes I'll make a Penzu note about that source and I'll give it a really long title that would say why I might want it later. So for example, I did come across one like that that was talking about how associate professors write in this very specific way. That's something I've been interested in, and with mid-career faculty and keeping up writing. So that's of course something I'm totally interested in, but it has nothing to do with this particular article that I'm working on, because I'm looking at ideally faculty that are in a couple of different phases. So who knows? I might change my mind and decide I'm doing just after tenure associate rank people only. Who knows? If that's the case, then I'll bring that one back in. So I'm hoping that this is helpful to kind of think through how I'm starting to read a source, say, oh, that's a really good quote, I want that, put it in my Penzu note so I have it in a spot, and then writing back to why I want that note. How that's going to translate into a draft will happen in probably two ways. One, as I do that more and more, I start saying, yep, these are the same themes that keep coming out. These are the same things I want to do. And eventually I'll build a very, very loose structure of what the article will look like. I don't use any kind of like Roman numerals or outlines. I usually just make like a quick list. These are a couple points I want to make. And then I start thinking through the note I've already written where I've taken stuff from the readings. I try to figure out, well, where would that go? So I do build a loose kind of a structure. I'm not anywhere close to doing that yet, but in a couple weeks I will be. And then the next thing that would happen from that structure would be a start at a draft. Sometimes I'm working on the structure and the draft at the same time. So for example, one thing that I know I will do, I will look at that note and say, oh, okay, out of this whole note, I know I want these 5 things to show up in the article for sure. I'll copy and paste them and I will move them into a document. They might not be in the place they're going to stay, but they're in the document. And usually I throw a kind of a working heading on top of it just for the moment. And then I'll go back to the structure, kind of think about it a little bit. So those 2 things might be happening simultaneously, but that would be how I'm starting to move what I read to how it's going to show up in an article. So hopefully that helps. Just a way to kind of think through how I'm using time. One last thing about sabbaticals, I know that I'm at pretty much like a halfway point. So I'll make a halfway point episode just to say like what I did, what I haven't done yet, because I think we always set these really like lofty goals and then we don't sometimes pull them off. But yeah, I'll do an episode on that, and happy writing this week.